Okay, here we go. Stand by. 3, 2, 1, action.
Assume nothing.
Brash, bald-faced blasphemy.
Question everything.
I find it extremely hard to imagine.
Open your eyes.
It is quite all right to be an atheist.
The fastest growing group of people in the country has been measured as being those who have no belief or who are atheists.
You don't have to be apologetic or quiet about it.
Challenge the opposition.
You see religion on 100 fronts losing the argument.
And start thinking. This is The Thinking Atheist Worldwide.
Tonight's podcast is brought to you by ComputerLearningZone.net. Great to have them on board as a new sponsor and supporter of the podcast. They specialize in online video tutorials for popular computer programs. Stuff like Microsoft Windows, Word, Excel, Microsoft Access, and a whole lot more. The owner of Computer Learning Zone is a guy named Richard Rost. He's been teaching computers for almost 2 decades. He's the author of The Complete Idiot's Guide to Excel, and he's put together a very special promotion just for our listeners. It's a bundle of over 15 hours of free video tutorials that you can watch online. No strings attached. You don't even have to put in your email address if you don't want to. There's no obligation. Richard gives away the Level 1 courses for free, hoping that you'll enjoy them enough to come back and purchase Level 2 and more. Check it out, ComputerLearningZone.net. They have a .com address, but it's the .net that is the special offer for our listeners. ComputerLearningZone.net.
Actual witchcraft, actual pagan religions, levitation, mind control, astral projection, and other forms of witchcraft ceremonies are portrayed within the cartoons.
All of these things are portrayed in the cartoons?
Yes, very much so.
Well, then we could suspect that there's some kind of a spiritual force behind these things to program our children.
But there are some things about Smurfs that we need to look at. First of all, you'll notice that they're depicted as blue with black lips.
Well, isn't that interesting?
And you know what happens to you when you die? You turn blue and your lips turn black.
In other words, these are depictive of dead creatures.
Right. She-Ra was sent to the 6th dimension. We're talking about Eastern religion. I mean, everything that has taken its basis from Hinduism and other religions like that has been added into our toys and cartoons these days. You know, if E.T.'s an alien and he came down and he did all the things that he did and he died and was resurrected again, then what about Jesus? Maybe he was an alien.
I pray in the name of Jesus today that any of you that have this bondage in your household, your children are rebellious and being drawn by these things, I pray in Jesus' name that God would break that bondage today.
Beware, my friends, because no matter where you look, no matter how benign or harmless or innocuous this toy might seem, or board game might look, or piece of music might sound, it very well might be a tool of Beelzebub. Those who weren't around, or at least paying attention, in the 70s, 80s, and 90s may have a hard time with what this show is about. They may think we have just lost our marbles. How could something like this have ever been a thing? But I assure you, it was a thing, and it was palpable, especially here in the United States of America. In that particular time, there was a real panic about satanic influence in pretty much everything. Those clips from our montage were actually part of a television special done by a guy named Phil Phillips and Pastor Gary Greenwald. Now, Phil Phillips is author of several books about satanic influence targeting young children. The books include Turmoil in the Toy Box, Halloween and Satanism, Saturday Morning Mind Control, that's about Saturday morning cartoons, and Dinosaurs, the Bible, Barney, and Beyond. That's right, Barney is evil. In fact, if you listen to Phil Phillips speak, or Pastor Greenwald speak, you will come quickly to the conclusion that everything is evil. Popular in the 1980s, He-Man is a hero in the Masters of the Universe series, and he and his friends defend the secrets of Castle Grayskull from the forces of Skeletor. By the way, he is also satanic.
God isn't master of the universe. He-Man is.
He-Man is more powerful than Jesus Christ.
Right. He-Man has more power than Jesus. He-Man has more power than Jesus.
Think Star Wars is just a harmless piece of science fiction? Think again.
Characters like Darth Vader, who look almost exactly like the ancient Norse god Odin, and Obi-Wan Kenobi, and there's a form of witchcraft called Obi witchcraft, in which chanting Obi, Obi, Obi over and over again releases the power into the witch's lies. And Yoda's called the Zen master. He's always seen with serpents around him or serpents around his neck.
Look at the serpents around his neck there.
And finally, the dreaded Dungeons and Dragons.
I do not think that many parents are aware of what's inside the game. In fact, in my presentation, I show many pictures from the inside the books just to show the images of this game. I mean, the gruesomeness of this game and the occult link to it.
Well, I know that when I did my message, and this has happened, I have letter after letter where people took the pieces. Now, there's sixes involved in the pieces of the game, but they'd take the pieces of the game, they would throw them in the incinerator or the fireplace, and screams would come out because there seemed to be some kind of spiritual forces inhabiting those pieces.
This stuff was prevalent in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. Well, how did this mess get started? Well, I think it was a perfect storm of different factors, different cultural things coming to head at the same time, sort of the rise of fundamental Christianity and its warnings about a very real Satan and burning in a very real hell, and some very charismatic people who were out there telling wild, crazy, and often frightening stories of satanic work in the United States. I wanted my first guest on the show tonight to be somebody who could relate to me, aka being relatively close to my age group and demographic, who was alive during the Satanic Panic, and somebody I knew our listeners would really enjoy hearing again. And so I asked Steve from Tennessee, a longtime listener and a guy who's always entertaining, ask him to call the show and sort of give us his take on the Satanic Panic. Steve, how you doing, man?
Hanging in there like a hair in a biscuit, man.
Well, tonight's show is sort of rooted in the 80s Satanic Panic. Of course, we're talking about instances of, the devil being everywhere today. I don't know, you have any experience with this kind of thing?
Oh, this is a subject near and dear to my heart. I won't take up the whole show because I want to hear other people's viewpoints, but this thing hit. Well, I was about 14 years old when I finally quit calling myself a Christian. I was still a little bit of a deist, but I just checked out of the religion. And about the same time, the 2020 special dropped. If you remember that one, the 2020 News magazine, for people who don't remember, in the 80s, it was a popular show. They did a satanic special, and we watched it, and my fire-breathing Pentecostal mother was shocked to find out that there's such prevalence of Satanism in this country, that they're after her little boy. And I remember when they even mentioned that it was perfectly legal. She stood up out of her chair and was like, what? And my musical taste at that time, I've always had a wide variety of interest in music, but like every other 14-year-old boy in America, I like my AC/DC, I like my Motley Crue, I like my Ozzy Osbourne, I like my Judas Priest. And when they started getting paraded out and held up as these great Satanists, and of course, they didn't help by putting pentagrams on their freaking album covers.
Yeah, they definitely played the occult card for shock value. Back then it was shocking. Now today it looks kind of trite. Back then, Ozzy Osbourne, Diary of a Madman album cover was proof he was an agent of Beelzebub.
If the 2020 special was a jab, a right cross came. Churches, and see if you remember this, back in the 80s, there was an updated version, but back in the 80s, we had a version of a thing that we were dragged to church and made to watch called Hell's Bells, The Dangers of Rock and Roll. Good friend of mine, his mother took us. We watched it. We go home. She starts interrogating him. do you have any of this music? Well, yeah, of course he did. Where do you get this stuff? He said, usually in the discount bin, because, we were people of modest means. And he was forced to give it all up. So, of course, it worked out for me because I got to buy all of his tapes for like $2 a pop, right? But I remember even thinking then, if he truly believes, because he did on his own volition tell me that he wanted, no more secular music in his house. I mean, the guy's a minister today. But I remember thinking, if he's really believing this, as he's selling me his music, as I'm buying his tapes off of him, as I get the money, isn't he kind of complicit in sending me to hell?
By giving you the music he just threw out? Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, get on YouTube, anybody who is not familiar with it, any of you younger people, and watch Hell's Bells, The Dangers of Rock and Roll. That's what we were spoon-fed. That's what we were force-fed back in the 80s. And then the big punch came with the Geraldo special. It was... I forget the title of it, but you just Google it, Geraldo Satanism. It was a 2-hour live broadcast with lots of guests, including Ozzy Osbourne, including people from the Church of Satan. And it was just basically a McCarthy-esque Satanism is everywhere. Every roadkill cat was probably actually ritually sacrificed by Satanists. He managed to find like the 5 or 6 Satan worshipers who have actually killed somebody and interviewed them for his program. And in my community, and I live in a little small rural town, you can't drive a mile without passing a church. In our rural community, it was like War of the Worlds, except spread out over a several-year period. Every time a dog came up missing, every time, and of course, teenagers being teenagers, people painted graffiti. People would make little altars in old buildings just to make people think Satanism's going on. And it became, like I said, McCarthyism. And at one point, and I have this on good authority, I don't know this factually, but I've been told by several people that actually myself and a couple of my friends wound up on a church's watch list because we had long hair, we liked our metal, and I like wearing trench coats.
A trench coat is a sure sign of evil at work in your life. Well, let's talk. I mean, what year did you graduate high school? Can I ask you that?
Yeah, 1990.
So you and I are pretty close. Were you privy to like the big Procter & Gamble scare that happened back then when Procter & Gamble was being funded by the Church of Satan? The Church of Satan was being funded, but with the proceeds of Procter & Gamble sales. And people everywhere boycotted Procter & Gamble without making a freaking phone call to P&G to find out what it was all about.
Could you not see the obvious 666 in the old man's beard on the label? Or KISS. Remember KISS, the KISS, Knights in Satan's Service? I'm ashamed to say I've had to actively participate in the burning of a stack of KISS records.
So you actually did an album burning. What was that like?
Weird and pointless, and I was out my KISS Dynasty album.
So wait, you weren't all in. You weren't thinking, I'm vanquishing the evil, I'm going to destroy the work of Satan. You were reluctant in this little escapade.
My aha moment, the point where I first started questioning my religious beliefs, happened the summer I turned 11. The Satanic Panic happens while I was in high school. So yeah, I was way out of that mindset. I didn't believe there was a devil, and I didn't think Motley Crue actually worshiped him.
Did you guys have to go through the big Dungeons and Dragons thing? Anybody who played D&D was automatically opening a portal to hell, to demonic possession. Did you guys go through that in your neck of the woods?
Yes, we did, in spades. That was also one of the reasons would get you on the list of people not to associate with, anyone who played D&D. And I played Dungeons and Dragons, but I wasn't as into it as some guys. But again, it was just a game. But no, it's got, look at the shape of the dice. Surely that heralds something, whatever.
I think for us it was, you aren't just pretending to be a wizard. You are role-playing. You are actually sort of becoming a wizard by calling down dark spirits. They had these long explanations for why this game and this particular sort of culture was so powerful. And you're right, we cordoned off the D&D crowd. We were nervous about them because we thought we might get infected with evil by osmosis if we stood too close.
That's kind of what I wanted to ask you about, because you were on the other side of this equation. You and I were enemies back then. I'm just curious at what your mindset was toward the guys in your high school who would go to a Motley Crue concert or a Molly Hatchet playing in their car.
I'd like to go back in time and find myself in high school. I'd just like to kick my own ass. I was the kind of guy who just drove people crazy. Now, even in a private Christian school, we had a lot of pop music. We called it secular music. A lot of it was pretty benign. Chicago, Kansas, Journey. But there were also AC/DC, Motley Crue, Poison, Twisted Sister, Ozzy Osbourne. Iron Maiden was always a big one, was it Iron Maiden with the album covers that...
Yes. Eddie, the time-traveling cyborg.
Yeah, that's right. And those were a big deal. And, I was really hardcore at the time into Christian music, and I was so sanctimonious about it. I was listening to Jesus music, and they were listening to the world's music, to the point where when somebody got in my car to go to lunch, we had an off-campus, open campus for high school lunch, we'd hop down, go down to Arby's or something. I would always play the Christian equivalent of whatever was hot in rock music at the time, hoping to convert the people sitting in my back seat. I was the most irritating cat probably in the entire school. It embarrasses me to think about it,
I had a couple of friends like you that they would want to drag you to some Christian music concert, and just the quality was always just slightly not as good.
Yeah.
If these people had any real talent, they would have switched over to secular music and really made the money.
Well, there's a saying that says, why create mediocrity when you can copy genius? That's exactly what Christian culture did, right? And we had a Christian version of so much in pop culture. Oh, if you like this, well, you're going to love this. And we'd give them the Jesus version, which was hugely watered down and obviously a carbon copy. But we were scared of the devil. Devils in movies, the devil's music was big. And a lot of times pop radio and metal music and those things would actually turn that screw. I mean, some bands would actually embed backward messages in the albums just so you could find it.
Judas Priest got hauled into court over that. Somebody tried to sue over a teenager who committed suicide. That, to me, set a dangerous precedent. Fortunately, it was thrown out that there's just no way that could have caused this young man to end his own life. Back to the Satanic Panic and the way it hit home for me, my poor mother, and I don't want to talk bad about her. We lost her 3 years ago, and I miss her terribly. But my poor mother was just terrified. Here her son was not wanting to go to church anymore, not calling himself a Christian anymore, listening to this music, and now she's been told there's this great network of Satanists out there who are after her little boy. And she became so fearful that, again, I listened to a wide variety of music. While I did like my Motley Crue, I was also a big Steve Winwood fan, and I was a huge Yes fan. And I always wanted to go to concerts, and I was never allowed to go to concerts. That's why I go to concerts every chance I get now. And Yes was going to be in Nashville, and I really wanted to go. They were touring to support their Big Generator album, and I really wanted to go. I was the only 16, 17-year-old Yes fan I knew, but I had somebody who was going to take me if I would buy the tickets. I'd been working. I had the money. I could buy the tickets. All I needed was parental permission. So I begged her, can I please go to this concert? Who is it again? I said, Yes. She goes, and what does YES stand for? And like that, it came to me. Young Evil Satanists.
No way. You are so full of shit. Is that true?
No,
Did that really happen?
The story's true. That actually happened. My diseased brain clicked in like that and come out with the worst smart-ass answer to give my mother. So hell no, I'm going. And there was no walking it back. There was no listening to the music. There was no reading any lyric sheets.
You totally sabotaged your own concert.
I've got a history of that.
So, I mean, I don't want to trample on your mom's grave here, but what's that about? Was it a deal where she just had enough information to make her dangerous? Why do you think she was so terrified of everything out there in the world?
We were very superstitious, fire-breathing Pentecostal people without actually associating with the actual Pentecostal name brand because that was of this world. We went to a small church with an attendance of about 5 to 8 people per Sunday. True story. Our preacher liked to weed people out. He didn't want any non-hackers who didn't pack the gear to be in our church. This is off topic, but we were having service one Sunday, and this nice couple came in. It was like a husband and a wife and 2.5 children, dressed nicer than we do. They had really good comportment, and in fact, they looked like the type of people who might even know the definition of the word comportment. Well, our preacher, this is somebody I truly love too. He's a great guy, but he turned it on. I mean, he turned it on, the stomping and the sweating and the microphones and the jumping and the shouting, and he got everybody fired up and riled up. So he had new blood in there, and he's going to see what they were made of. Gets to the end of his sermon. He says, I see we got guests here. We're proud to have you. If you're looking for a church home, we hope you consider us. We have no bylaws. We have no ordination. I'm not an ordained minister on any official level. We're just people who love God. He said, and just as you look around for church home, I just want you to realize not every church is God's church. Satan has some of these churches. My wife, Ava Sue, and I, here a while back, we visited a church. He never said which one or when this happened, but we visited a church, and I kept noticing something moving behind a PV amplifier by the stage. I looked, and I watched, and sure as I was sitting there, the devil himself stood up from behind the PV amplifier. I'm not even making this up. He's saying this. So the whole time I'm watching this couple out of the corner of my eye, because I'm like, here we go. We're going to find out. We're going to see if they got what it takes to be here. He said, the devil himself stood up behind that PV amplifier, and I grabbed Ava Sue by the hand. I said, Ava Sue, we got to leave. The devil has this church. And I couldn't resist anymore. I turned fully, and I swear I could see the swirls of air where they were gone so fast that it could be said they vanished instantly. They were out of there. That's the kind of church we went to. We were young earth creationists. One of the worst things I ever did was bring home a book on evolution. I'd probably gotten less of a talking to if I'd brought home pornography. And we lived in what Carl Sagan described as a demon-haunted world. We operated under the auspices that not a sparrow falls from the sky, that your Heavenly Father didn't ordain it. Your Heavenly Father knows the number of hairs on your head. That's where we come from, and that's the mindset. And so when my mother watches the 2020 thing, when she watches the Geraldo report, when people at work tell her things like KISS, K-I-S-S stands for Knights in Satan's Service, she tends to err on the side of believing the supernatural element. She would tend to lean into the more fantastic element. And so, yeah, there were dark forces all around, and they were after her child, a child who at 14 pronounced to her that he didn't consider himself a Christian anymore and would like to stop going to church.
She burst into flame, I'll bet. I mean, that's crazy.
It was I'll tell you how I got out of that. It was about a 2-year fight. So I finally started dating a girl who was a Methodist. And I started going to the Methodist church, because Methodist church is just Sunday sing-along and social hour. They're not overly serious about it. And that got her off my back for a while. But
I find it entertaining and honestly kind of refreshing to talk to somebody who actually experienced a lot of this sort of the satanic panic of the 1980s firsthand. I totally get you. I mean, some people are probably listening to us thinking, they're from another planet. This is crazy. Who thinks like this? But it was everywhere. Dude, it's great to hear your perspective. You're always extremely entertaining. I knew you'd be a great way to kick off the show. And do me a favor and look around there, because I thought I heard like hoof steps behind you. I thought there might be a pitchforked creature back there behind you, maybe behind the PV amp coming after you.
Hey, I would love to meet such a creature. You're talking to a guy who, as a kid, stood in front of a dark mirror and did the Bloody Mary thing just to see what would happen. I played with Ouija boards by myself just to see if I could get possessed. If there's something supernatural out there, I want to know about it. I want to experience it, and I want to see it, but it never pans out.
You are a true skeptic, Steve. That's refreshing, man. You're awesome. You take care of yourself, and hopefully we'll get up your way one of these days with a tour stop, all right?
Yeah, if you come within 100 miles of me, man, I'm buying you a beer.
All right, sounds good. We'll see you later.
Cool.
Earlier in the show, I mentioned some very charismatic figures who were going out and speaking in churches and appearing on television, on the radio, and writing books and really stirring the pot of the Satanic Panic. One of those charismatic figures was a guy named John Todd, became popular in the 1980s. He was an evangelist and Christian apologist, and he had a compelling backstory. You see, he was born into a family of witches, and he was being groomed to be a member of the Illuminati as part of a master plan to take over the United States, wipe out Christianity, and make witchcraft the quote-unquote religion of the USA. It's part of a new world order. But thanks be to Jesus, he saw the light, received Christ, and then he toured all around the country to warn the rest of us, I'm sure at the end of an offering plate. And he had some crazy assertions. He believed that then President Jimmy Carter was actually possibly the Antichrist, which of course the Antichrist heralds the beginning of the end times. He claimed that John F. Kennedy was an agent of the devil, was still alive, and that he, John Todd, had been Kennedy's personal warlock. John Todd's story had been represented in a series of evangelistic tracts, these little comics called Chick Tracts, produced by a guy named Jack Chick. I think those things are still out there today. And they were very doom and gloom and warning of evil in everything. And he actually had a character using his witch name, which was Lance Collins, who was a character inside one of the Chick tracks. They talk about playing rock music on cassette, and just the playing of the songs would cause spells to be cast and kids to become demon possessed. And as I understand it, at the end of this particular comic called Spellbound, the hero of the story burns his records and his books and says, "Hey, I'm free. I finally found freedom now that I've burned all this material." By the way, John Todd's career ended dubiously. He was accused of making sexual advances toward young women and teenage girls at Christian meetings. And at a Jesus Movement coffee house, they said he was starting to incorporate witchcraft teachings into his Christian Bible studies, allegations of carrying a .38 handgun into church meetings, and he was doing drugs. Eventually, I guess he fell back to witchcraft, started a coven, and became the subject of criminal investigations over alleged sexual relations with underage girls as part of a coven initiation. In fact, the coven's charter was revoked by local leaders. So the Christian church didn't want him, and the witches didn't want him either. The guy essentially ended his quote-unquote career in disgrace. But you can see what I'm talking about, warning parents to lock up their children and their animals because the occult and satanic ritual often involved children and animals, and something referred to as satanic ritual abuse. And alleged victims of satanic ritual abuse came out of the woodwork in the 80s and 90s. Court cases and criminal investigations nationwide. Wild stories about slaughtering animals for satanic sacrifice, that type of thing. And of course, when Halloween came around, the warnings about satanic ritual abuse or satanic influence or practices, that just amplified. And this is the devil's day. It's Halloween. Steeped in evil, so infected with demons and demonic influence that a lot of religious children at the time, and even today, forbidden to celebrate Halloween altogether. Certainly forbidden from dressing up in any sort of costumes that might be evil, like devils or witches or wizards, right? They're not just costumes. These are depictions, reenactments, celebrations of satanic activity. And those warnings can be seen on websites like demonbuster.com, which says this, and I quote, "Isn't the whole theme of Halloween, isn't the whole theme one of darkness, death, fear, threats, destruction, and evil? There are witches, broomsticks, bats, owls, ghosts, skeletons, death, and monsters. You dress up your children as demons and witches and ghouls and monsters and werewolves, and you send them out into the street in the darkness to reenact the Druids' practice of demanding food from people under threat of tricks or curses if they don't comply." I guess we can't really address the Satanic Panic and satanic ritual abuse or allegations of it without talking about the McMartin trial in the 80s. A family-owned preschool in California was charged to be practicing satanic ritual abuse, sexually abusing kids and practicing Satanism and or witchcraft, and they blur the line. I mean, some people really draw a distinction, but if you're in the Christian church, witchcraft and Satanism are exactly the same thing. So bear with me because I'm going to be speaking in the terminology of the church. And this trial, the McMartin trial, went on for years and years. It became the longest and most expensive criminal trial in American history to that time. And I think it was the supernatural element that sort of brought this particular case to the front of tabloids all across the country and even around the world. Hundreds of children ended up being interviewed by an organization called the Children's Institute International, based in Los Angeles. And there were stories apparently coming from these children who were interviewed about satanic influence and witches flying and underground tunnels beneath the building where the children might be transported in secret. And you can imagine how scandalous and sensational all this was. 321 counts of abuse involving 48 kids. 7 years and $15 million later, the whole escapade resulted in 0 convictions. And Children's Institute International was criticized for what was called highly suggestive interviewing techniques and methods of questioning. They reviewed the videotapes of the interviews of the kids, and people like British clinical psychologist Dr. Michael Maloney called the interview techniques improper, coercive, directive, problematic, adult-directed in a way that forced the children to follow a rigid script, and that many of the children's statements were actually generated by the examiner interviewing them. A lot of leading questions. Some of the child testimony was so wild as to be laughable. One kid, asked to identify his abuser, picked out a picture of Chuck Norris. On top of all this, it came to light that these allegedly abused kids and their parents had been in dialogue with a couple people named Michelle Smith and Lawrence Pazder. They co-authored a book called Michelle Remembers, which was a supposed autobiography about a girl, Michelle, who had experienced satanic ritual abuse. This book long since discredited, but it was a famous book at the time. And there's little doubt that the influence of these two helped to color the quote-unquote testimonies of the children, perhaps fueling the stories that the McMartins were witches who could fly, those types of things. And there's no compelling evidence that any abuse of any kind ever took place. In fact, one of the kids, grown to adult, made a statement back in 2005 that he made the whole thing up and he was really sorry. And at the end of all this, the McMartins get a not guilty verdict, but their lives are already ruined. Already ruined. The preschool wasn't just shut down, the building was dismantled. Their family name linked by millions to satanic forces and the abuse of children. And this was far from the only instance of satanic panic. 1991, Faith Chapel Church, Spring Valley, California, was alleged to be the site of satanic ritual abuse. They killed animals in front of children. They drank human blood. They abducted kids from their parents. The case ultimately tossed out by a grand jury because there was just no evidence to support it. In fact, the accused actually settled a countersuit for $2 million. Dan and Fran Keller of Oak Hill, they were proprietors of a small daycare. That same year, 1991, when they were accused of sadistic abuse, making children drink Kool-Aid laced with blood, and videotaping sex between children and adults and children with other children. As part of satanic rituals, they allegedly unearthed the dead in cemeteries, and they used those same cemeteries to hide freshly sacrificed animals. Crazy horror stories about executing animals with chainsaws, that kind of stuff. The trial lasted all of 6 days, and the Kellers were convicted back in 1991. They were sentenced to 48 years apiece. Later examination of the evidence revealed some serious problems. There was no physical evidence of any abuse. The medical exams of the children were flawed. There was court testimony by somebody who called himself an expert on satanic ritual abuse. There was the withholding of information from the defense by the prosecution. And on November of last year, 2013, now remember, this case started in 1991. Last November, the Kellers were finally released on bond because they were likely denied the right to a fair trial. Somebody finally came to that conclusion after they'd lost 21 years of their lives in prison. Dan Keller is now 72 years old. He walks with a cane. His wife is 63, a huge piece of their lives, stolen by an event that never happened back in 1991. There was an article recently in Slate which was talking about the satanic panic of the 80s and 90s. The article called "The Real Victims of Satanic Ritual Abuse," written by Linda Rodriguez. From her article, it said this: while that investigation, it was talking about the Keller investigation, while that investigation and trial unfolded, other cases surfaced. Media poured attention on the claims, which made great fodder for a newly created 24-hour news cycle. CNN headline news launched in 1982. As televangelists prayed for deliverance from Satan's scourge, talk show experts, quote-unquote, claimed that every imaginable form of abuse was happening on a massive scale in America, and that networks of Satanists had infiltrated schools, the police, and local government. Geraldo Rivera claimed in a televised 1987 special report that more than 1 million Satanists were plying their evil trade in America right at the very moment. Geraldo has since apologized. In 1989, Oprah Winfrey interviewed Michelle Smith, there she is again, and another woman who claimed to have recovered memories of being abused by a satanic cult. Sally Jesse Raphael, another daytime talk show host not to be outdone, ran 2 shows on the subject. In 1990, Don't Make Me Go Back, Mommy, a child's book about satanic ritual abuse, a children's picture book featuring colored pencil drawings of children being abused in satanic rituals, appeared in libraries and therapists' offices. In 1992, folk singer Joan Baez released the song Play Me Backwards, a song in the voice of a victim of satanic ritual abuse who was forced to witness the sacrifice of a baby and is now recollecting her repressed memories. A few people have referenced the 1988 Geraldo Rivera television special, a sensational broadcast called Exposing Satan's Underground. And yes, you can find the entire thing on YouTube. In fact, I will link part 1 in the description box of this show in case you're curious. But it is a hugely sensationalistic look at Satanism and satanic ritual abuse, and I just sort of spliced together a few clips from the very first few minutes of the Geraldo special from 1988.
Satanism is more than a hodgepodge of mysticism and fantasy, more than a Halloween motif. It's a violent impulse that preys on the emotionally vulnerable, especially teenagers, often lonely and lost.
It basically started out like with the killing of animals. Then there's always the heavy metal music, and drugs don't help.
It attracts the angry and the powerless, who often sink into secret lives.
They asked me if I had ever thought about killing somebody just to watch them die, and they asked me if I would like to join a satanic cult.
Possessed by an obsessive fascination with sex and drugs, and yes, heavy metal rock and roll. Satan's child. Often Satanism seems to be a personal psychodrama, a kind of license for strange, sometimes violent behavior. Today there are cults that worship the devil, engage in secret ceremonies, believe in ancient, though bizarre theology, all of it constitutionally protected, as long as no laws are broken.
I believe that hate is necessary in a controlled way just as much as love is necessary.
The other face of adult Satanism is violent and fiendish, centered on sexual ritual and torture, frequently descending into the vilest crime of all, sexual abuse of children.
You know, you hear stuff like this, and then you look at the 24-hour news cycle here in the year 2014, and you become struck by how little has really changed. I mean, there's just no difference anymore between news and tabloid news. Again, Geraldo has since apologized for that particular special. And I wanted to finish sort of the category of satanic ritual abuse with this from the Skeptic's Dictionary. A 4-year study in the early 1990s found the allegations of satanic ritual abuse to be without merit. The study was conducted by University of California at Davis psychology professors Gail S. Goodman and Philip R. Shaver in conjunction with Johnson Quinn of UC Davis and Betty I. Bottoms at the University of Illinois at Chicago. Their study was supported by the National Center on Child Abuse and Neglect. The researchers investigated more than 12,000 accusations and surveyed more than 11,000 psychiatric, social service, and law enforcement personnel. The researchers could find no unequivocal evidence for a single case of satanic cult ritual abuse. Of course, that doesn't stop the allegations from flying. Have you heard the one about Satan on the dollar bill? It's the all-seeing eye, the illuminated eye, the great architect Lucifer's eye is at the top of the pyramid on the back of the American dollar bill. Also, the number 13 is apparently represented across this particular piece of currency. 13 arrows, 13 leaves, 13 berries, 13 layers of brick. Unbelievable. To the phones, area code 937. You're on the Thinking Atheist radio podcast. Thanks for waiting. Who's this?
This is Larry.
Larry, thanks for calling. We're talking about the Satanic Panic.
You were talking about the backwards masking and the music. Were you ever familiar with an evangelist named John Muncie?
Doesn't ring a bell, no.
He was more of a Midwest guy. I never got the chance to go see him, but somebody I knew had a couple of his tapes, and he went through the whole bit. Basically, it was just like a recording of one of his meetings or what have you. And so he would give all of these examples of the backwards messages in rock music. But what he would do is a lot of times he would tell you what you were going to hear. Then he would play the example. Then he would say it again.
Michael Shermer actually did a great piece on this where he played a segment of music forward and then backward again after telling you what to listen for. And it's amazing how you can hear the patterns the second time around. In fact, that's a little experiment that I'm about to perform here on the radio for this audience using a Led Zeppelin song. And it's amazing when you hear it the first time, it sounds kind of like gibberish. And then when I tell you what the lyrics are, what Satan's message genuinely is, and you hear it again, well, now it's obvious. Yeah, that's the work of Satan.
Well, I've done my own experiments, actually. I mean, this was back in the day when the 80s when I had the tape. And there was the Styx song, Snowblind. And his example was he played part of it backwards, and he was saying, it says, "Oh, Satan, use our voices." So I thought, well, I'm going to try a little experiment. So I didn't play the people what he said it was going to sound like. I just told them to listen to it, and I said, "What do you think that sounds like?" And they're like, "Well, it sounds like gibberish." I said, "Now listen really closely, and you're going to hear them say, 'Carl Sagan, move your horses.'" And I played it for them again, and they're like, "Oh my God, that's what it says."
Carl Sagan, move your horses. Yeah, that sounds intentional to me, for sure. Well, that was that particular song was a point of controversy back when it was released in '81. But at the California State Legislature, and Tipper Gore was in on it. They were talking about the lyrics being Satanist or Satanistic, and it had backwards messages. It's damaging to our youth. I mean, a lot of this stuff resulted in like congressional hearings. I mean, it's hard to explain to people today how intense it was back then.
And then one of the things that this Muncie guy played was some Christian music, and his thing was, the devil hadn't got all the good music. And he played some examples of Christian music with backwards messages in it, but it wasn't the gibberish that you would hear in the secular tunes. It was an obviously recorded message and then just flipped and played backwards in the song. His reasoning behind that was, well, God puts good messages backwards.
Even the Christian rock band,
Christian music.
Petra, did a little backward segment on one of their songs. They thought they were being clever, and you play it in reverse, and it says, "What are you looking for the devil for when you ought to be looking for the Lord?" It was that kind of a culture. So,
one more thing, just real quick. You mentioned the Chick pamphlets.
Chick tracts, yeah.
There's one of the Chick tracts, yeah. We had one of those that specifically dealt with Dungeons and Dragons, and it was hilarious. These kids were around playing Dungeons and Dragons, and the one character, I still remember to this day, Blackleaf. The dungeon master says, "Blackleaf, I declare you dead." And this person just became distraught and killed themselves.
Chick tracts are disturbing. Back then we thought they were these tools. Some parents on Halloween would put those in Halloween candy sacks instead of candy. Oh, you don't get candy, you get a Chick tract. And then you really hate these people. And then you really despise your neighbor.
What is it? Candy, damn it. Give me
that
candy.
That was up there with those, weren't those $20 bills that were folded in half and they'd leave them laying on the ground? And you'd go pick him up and you'd unfold him, and it wasn't a $20 bill, but a religious message about how you needed to repent of your sins and accept Jesus Christ. And you just felt so pissed off that you'd been lied to that it had the opposite effect, you know?
Jesus tricked me. I don't want anything to do with it anymore then.
What would Jesus do? Would Jesus have lied to this child? I don't think so. Thanks for calling, my friend. Thanks for being a part of the show. We'll see you later.
All right.
Take care of yourself.
All right, you too. Thanks.
I had an email in from Mick along the backward masking line. He said this: I remember a backmasking claim against Led Zeppelin's Stairway to Heaven. If memory serves, there's a line that when played backwards says, "Here's to my sweet Satan." When played normally, the line says, "There's still time to change the road you're on." Well, here's that little segment of music played backwards. Now, you heard "My Sweet Satan," right? My Sweet Satan. Allegedly, when you play the song backward, it also says much more. "Here's to my sweet Satan, the other's little path would make me sad, whose power is faith, he'll give those with him 666. And all the devil fools, they know he made us suffer, sadly." Now I'm going to play this clip for you again, and you tell me if you hear a little more than you heard the first time. And this really takes me back. They brought us, when I was in junior high school, they brought us into a room with some guy. I don't even know who he was. He was the expert. They brought him in, and they brought all of us school children, impressionable young pod people, into a room, and they warned us about the dangers of rock music. And this cat spent about an hour spinning all of these albums backwards, playing satanic messages. And of course, we were in 6th grade. We were terrified. Man, that stuff will creep you out anyway, even if you don't hear any messages in there. Just the backward sound kind of gives you the goosebumps. Well, this stuff terrified a generation. Mick's email continues. He says, "As a former believer, the time to change the road I was on means something different to me now. It feels like freedom from the manipulation and guilt my belief system burdened me with. There's still time to change the road you're on." Good stuff, Mick. Thanks so much for a great message. Back to the switchboard, area code 347. You're on the Thinking Atheist Radio podcast. Who's this?
My name is Caesar, and I'm calling you from New York. And it's amazing what you're doing, because it was not only in America to talk about such a subject, because in Brazil, you know, Rebecca Brown with the book, He Came to Set the Captives Free, was a big deal. And in Brazil, there's a lot of Santeria, Umbanda, Candomblé, and sacrifice of animals. And that completely bombed the population in Rio de Janeiro. And I was one of the guys that actually read the book and accepted Christ because of that book. And it derailed my life completely, because after reading that book, I had to burn all my CDs, long plays, get rid of shirts, and have a completely crazy life, because everywhere I was looking at, I would see Satan's hands. And it was just amazing.
You bring up a great point that this was prevalent in the United States, but it actually rippled far beyond the borders of the USA. And as Matt in our chat room just pointed out, we talk a lot about it happening in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, but there is a lot of this that, believe it or not, goes on today. There are parents and pastors and whole cultures that are scaring the literal devil
Yes, indeed.
out of people.
Yes, indeed. Even more in countries like, not like in USA, in here in America, because sacrifice of animals and stuff like that is not a big deal. But when you read books like He Came to Set Captives Free or such, And you have like Santo Domingo, Republic of Puerto Rico, and Brazil, and whole South America, and other places. Like in Africa, they do indeed sacrifice animals up to today. They do that today. And they associate everything with the devil, and it's approved that the devil exists, and they completely believe it. It's spreading across the globe, and it's indeed destroying lives. You see that going on in Africa, kids being sacrificed and being killed by pastors because there's such association with the devil and all. But yes, indeed, it happened in Brazil. It does happen in Brazil still, and it's a big topic. In America, that may not be a problem as much as it used to be, perhaps, but in South America and in Brazil, the born-again Christian branch is just growing tremendously. And this demonic warfare, it's being used there as a tool to get new born-again Christians. And thank you so much, Seth, for what you did, because one more thing is that due to the fact that I use logic and reason, my mom, which was the first one to convert in our family, a year ago, she became a born-again atheist. Our relationship became a lot better because now she understands that there's no spiritual warfare and everything, and she's going back to school to study psychology and neuroscience.
Love it. Education sets people free, my friend. Well, thank you so much for the call and for the kind words. It's greatly appreciated, my friend. You be safe, all right?
All the best, brother. Take care, man.
All right. He's absolutely right that this sort of panic about sorcery and superstition continues. You read the story, was it last spring, about the young mother in New Guinea who was accused by her own townspeople of being a witch, and so they dragged her out and they stripped her and they covered her in gasoline and they burned her alive on top of a pile of trash. And this stuff happens all around the world. There's a website called InsideRockMusic.com that warns about rock and roll. Now, some of this is a little dated, but according to this website, it says, "Do rock groups worship and serve Satan? They surely do, and this by their own admission. Here are several examples of how these rockers openly declare their abject loyalty to the devil. The rock group Black Sabbath has been known to make altar calls to Lucifer in some of their concerts." By the way, those of you who've attended a Sabbath show, I'll leave you to do a little peer review on that. You can give me a report from the field. I kind of doubt it. Back to the article. Stevie Nicks of Fleetwood Mac, known for openly dedicating their concerts to the witches of the world. In their Shout at the Devil album, Motley Crue has a song entitled God Bless the Children of the Beast. A master Satanist, Aleister Crowley, helped teach Anton LaVey, who started the Satanic Church of America, with headquarters in San Francisco. Before his death, Crowley made human sacrifices in his home. That house is now owned by Led Zeppelin guitarist Jimmy Page. Here are several rock groups which have openly identified with Aleister Crowley and his satanic teachings: Iron Maiden, Hall & Oates, the Beatles, Zeppelin, Ozzy Osbourne, the Eagles, and the Rolling Stones. Well, this brings up a point. It was a while back, I guess it was around Halloween of 2012, that we actually did a great podcast on the Church of Satan. It was fascinating stuff, and we talked to the high priest of the Church of Satan, Peter H. Gilmore, and we asked him point blank, does the Church of Satan worship the devil? And here is his response from that show.
That's a complete misconception. Satanism starts with atheism. We believe that the universe is utterly indifferent to us, and that because we place ourselves as our highest value in our own self-created system of values, we consider ourselves our own gods. So at most, we could say we're self-deifiers, and we reject the idea of anything supernatural. We don't believe in an afterlife. We don't believe in souls. We don't believe in demons or devils. Possession, of course, seems to be a psychological problem, not a supernatural one. And, of course, it doesn't stop people from writing us almost every day asking how they can sell their soul to become rich, famous, and have sex with whoever they want.
They're trying to cash in, huh?
Well, they're trying, but, they're perpetual losers, and they're going to stay that way, I'm sure.
Let's talk a little bit about the ritual, the tradition. Some people, you hear it every day, the accusation that it's theater, you guys are just being provocative, you're just trying to turn the screw. Why so much harsh symbolism? Why so much shocking tradition? Why do this over just being, say, an atheist or a humanist?
Well, in fact, we find that to be a lot of fun. Our creator, Anton LaVey, was a man who spent a good deal of his life in show business. He was in the carnival circuit. He did some circus work. He'd play Calliope. He did lion taming. And all religion is showbiz to one extent or another, and we're about the only one that admits that. But we enjoy that. Metaphor and ritual is a hell of a good time. We think that actually a lot of folks who just want to be atheists and humanists get a little lost because they don't look at the human animal and really may see that these are aspects that are something that could be exercised to the benefit of the person rather than just be put aside. I remember that if you looked at American atheists under Madalyn Murray O'Hair, they were constantly trying to invent symbols for themselves and coming up with replacement rituals and such, because people kind of felt bereft, I think, not having anything that they could do that they could use to reinforce their own values. Ayn Rand talked about consciousness being conceptual and that you'd create metaphors out of a lot of percepts, you'd build up larger concepts, and that kind of idea that a symbol brings together so many different concepts all at one time. Symbolism is very powerful for the human animal. So we employ that, and we think we do it in a way that's a lot of fun for people who have our kind of aesthetic. And we don't feel that it's something that everybody should be interested in. We tend to be kind of Halloween-y sort of folk.
That was probably one of the biggest surprises when investigating and researching that show. The Church of Satan does not worship Satan, does not even believe in a literal Satan. In fact, they're just like very theatrical atheist libertarians. That's pretty much what they are. And the more I read about them and the more I discovered, the more I found myself thinking, I've got more in common with the Church of Satan than I have with the Protestant Church. But when I was growing up, it was easy to hear Church of Satan and automatically envision animals being sacrificed on the altar and virgins being kidnapped and all manner of demon possession and craziness, which is probably what the Church of Satan intended. They were trying to sort of turn that screw. Look, you folks want to be ignorant and sort of a fear-based culture? Fine. We'll do something theatrical that makes it even more traumatizing for you, and you can be traumatized until you finally come to your senses and do the research and find out what we're really about. Anyway, it was an interesting show. I'll try to remember to put the link to that Church of Satan broadcast in the description box of this show. Pokemon is satanic. Pokemon the Pocket Monster? Clearly satanic in that it promotes animal violence, demonism, science, and homosexuality. Some specific examples of evil Pokemon monsters. Now, I don't know the Pokemon characters, so if I get a name wrong, just hang with me. Alakazam. Look at the shape of Alakazam's head. It's the exact shape of a pentagram. It's also psychic and encourages the practice of witchcraft. Hypno lures and kidnaps young children. Pikachu. The shape of Pikachu's tail is the exact shape of the satanic Z. Satanic imaging directed at young children. Aerodactyl is a dinosaur and evolves from a fossil. True Christians know that dinosaurs were put on Earth by Satan in order to deceive us. Is this a Poe site? Is this like Landover Baptist? Because people honestly have charged that Pokemon is of the devil. Gengar. Am I saying that right? This Pokemon is a ghost. The idea of ghosts goes against the teachings of God because ghosts are souls that are not in heaven, are hell. The list goes on and on. By the way, many of the pop stars that you hear on the radio are also involved or sponsored by Satan. Katy Perry, Justin Bieber, Snoop Dogg, Agents of Satan, Britney Spears, Rihanna, Beyonce, Billy Ray Cyrus, Lady Gaga, Dr. Dre, Bob Dylan, Madonna, Justin Timberlake. Elvis Presley was once said to be of the devil. The entire rock music culture was said to be. Area code 616, thanks for waiting. You're on the Thinking Atheist radio podcast. Who's this?
This is Kyle.
Kyle, thanks for waiting. What's going on?
Hi, Seth. You were talking to a previous caller about like spiritual warfare and stuff like that, and I actually went to a place called Spiritual Warfare Camp, and it was terrifying, let me tell you. I remember we were walking one time and we were singing like ooh ee ooh ah ah ting tang walla walla bing bang. You know that song?
Yeah.
And we got in trouble because little did we know that he talks about a witch doctor. You know, I told the witch doctor I was in love with you. And it's a witch doctor, Seth. It's of the world. It's evil. Even like Hall & Oates. Like if you play Kiss on My Lips backwards, it says worship the devil. You know, it's crazy.
It's everywhere.
What people think, and it is.
It's everywhere.
The tiniest, simplest little things, Seth.
It's tragic to see people scared of their own shadow. They walk out the door and everything everywhere is some sort of an omen or some sort of an attack of the darkest of forces out there. I mean, and what a prison to live in that world.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, thanks for the call and thanks for being a part of the show. Anything else?
Have you ever seen a documentary called Paradise Lost?
I have not.
It's like in the mid-'90s, and it was about this triple homicide of these little boys. And it's really tragic. But basically what happened is these three boys and their teams were accused of killing these little boys. And it was like during this whole satanic hype, you know, and basically these three boys were rushed to trial with little to no evidence and were convicted of murder. And, you know, they had long hair and they listened to Metallica and stuff. And it was just really sad, you know, because, like, I'm a quiet dude, you know, I keep to myself and I wore black and had long hair. And it kind of hit home with me, you know, that they were just kind of brought to trial and found guilty with little to no evidence. So it's called Paradise Lost. If you ever get a chance, check it out. It's really good.
Will do. Thanks for the call, my friend. Appreciate it very much.
Thank you, Seth.
Take it easy. Had an email in from David. He said, I grew up in a Southern Baptist household. In typical fashion, my dad couldn't have given a rat's patootie about my religious indoctrination, except he hated rock and roll music and progressives. For him, it wasn't about religion, but rather politics and his warped view of the world. But dear old Mom made sure I got right with her God. My mom had Bibles and dashboard Jesuses all over the place. They sent me to an evangelical Christian school in Southwest Florida, aptly named Evangelical Christian School, for my 7th and 8th grade years in the mid-'70s. While there, a guest speaker came to rail against the satanic messages in rock music. His shtick was to use supposed feats of strength to illustrate the power of the Lord. He would bend rebar and drive nails with his hand. Incredible to many, but especially now through the filter of science, not so much. One of the places Satan is or was supposed to reside was the Beatles' Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds. He proposed that the song was about worshiping Satan. Get it? Lucy equals Lucifer in the sky, equals putting him up on high to be worshipped. With diamonds equals giving one's wealth and soul to the devil. At the end of his little show, a Beatles fan from a young age, me, asked him how he got Satan worship from the song when conventional wisdom at the time held the song was about LSD. We argued the point for some time before I was ushered off by the faculty and got detention. It was heresy to question his assertions. Ultimately, it led me to the realization that ignorance has no limits, especially the evangelical kind. David, thank you very much for the message. Area code 435. You're on the Thinking Atheist radio podcast. Who's this?
Hi, it's Jack from Utah.
Thanks for calling, Jack. What's going on?
I thought this would be a good night to call in and talk about one of my friends who is an open van Satanist who came to my town from a smaller and more rural town in central Utah. And I guess I wanted to talk a little bit about how there's definitely some blind fear of Satanists still in Utah.
Well, so it came to light that a Satanist had come to town and everybody started to whisper? Is that what happened? Or paint the picture for me.
Well, it's not that he came to my town and the problems really began. It's that he had to move. One of the driving factors that caused his family to move away because of how much he was getting bullied at school, not just by the students, but from what he's told me, essentially the teachers as well, though maybe more passively.
So he was essentially sort of looking for some fresh scenery for a new start, and he ended up having some of the same problems where you were, huh?
people literally thought he was possessed. When he went to school, he didn't have the opportunity to make any friends just because he was so ostracized by the community. And they didn't bother to ask him about what he thought about anything. And I might have brought it up before, but I said that he's a Levian Satanist. So it's not even that he believes in worshiping a literal devil. He just follows the Levian Satanism philosophy, which they didn't even bother to ask or show any curiosity about.
Well, he obviously chose to do so openly. You know, there are many people on the rolls at the Church of Satan who never tell anybody except their closest and most trusted loved ones. In fact, it is a requirement that those roles be kept secret. You know, if you sign up, you are anonymous. I had asked Peter H. Gilmore about this. I'm like, there must be a real stigma for a lot of people. And he's like, yeah, and some people just don't want anybody else to know. They actually join the church, but they keep it under their hat. They really don't tell anybody that they've done it. But apparently your friend had come clean and been open about his Levian Satanism.
Right. He's always been pretty open about it, but much of his experiences in that small town, he said, really gave him a sort of different attitude than he might have had about religious people. So I guess I wanted to just call in and say that the Satanic Panic is still alive in Utah.
Okay. Well, those Mormons up there, you know, now they're really freaked out with the American Atheist National Conference coming here in just over a month. They're going to have a heart attack when those folks show up.
It's much better for my friend in my town. He still gets some odd looks, but for the most part, there's enough diversity here that the Mormons who live here or the people who are fundamentalists tend to get over it.
Appreciate you calling the show, and thanks for listening.
Thanks for having me on, Seth. I appreciate what you do.
Take care of yourself.
Evening.
See you later. Let's do one more. I've got, is it Viola on Skype? You're on the Thinking Atheist radio podcast. Who's this?
Hello, this is Violi. Hi, Seth.
Hi.
I would like to talk to you about my left-handedness and how this was always linked to me being a child of devil and just wicked and maybe a witch as well. I remember when I was about 12 and I was at this family gathering of sorts. And there was this lady and she was talking to me. She wasn't a family member, but she was someone's friend. And, you know, she thought that I was quite a bright child and she was asking me about my school activities. So I told her I'm attending some art classes. And she said, oh, yes, so would you like to draw me something? So I did. And as I picked up the pen and I started to draw, her jaw just dropped and she was just looking at me. And I was like, what happened? And she said, well, why are you using your left hand? And then she was just like backing away slowly and just looking really petrified. And she was like, you know, starting to pray and saying, why did your parents let you draw with your left hand? Why is it? And I was like, I didn't even understand what it meant at the time because I happened to grow up in quite a secular home.
Well, hang on. Hold on. They thought because you were left-handed that you were demon-possessed or an agent of Satan?
Yes.
And what region of the world would this be in?
I'm from Slovakia. And Slovakia is predominantly a Christian Catholic country. And most people I know would be Christian Catholic. And I suppose it's sort of linked to devil being on the left side of God when he betrayed him or something like that. And that's why they always link left-handedness with these sort of things. And even I remember when I started school, my teacher, she was trying to convert me to write with right hand, but obviously my parents were really annoyed when I told them. And she then was not allowed to make me write with my right hand anymore. But it's still instilled, especially in the older generation. I'm 26 right now, 27. And, you know, it's just instilled in the older generation that there's something inherently wrong in writing with left hand. I suppose I'm lucky that I grew up in quite a secular home, but, you know, it's still sometimes I will come across and people go, oh, so you're left-handed, oh, so your parents never tried to change you. No, why would they? That would be strange.
Yeah, well, I'm glad they didn't. And I'll tell you, if I was right there and we were face-to-face, I would high-five you with my left hand. So good for you, okay?
Nice to be back.
Thank you so much for calling, and appreciate you being a part of the show, and have a wonderful week, all right?
You too, thank you. Bye.
All right, take care. Had an email in from Gwen who said this: as a, quote, good Christian parent, I bought into the panic, the satanic panic. Every few years, there were new satanic items to be purged from our home. It's with deep regret that I recall frightening my young children into parting with their favorite toys, movies, games, and missing out on school activities. Frank Peretti's book, This Present Darkness, left me convinced that homeschool was the only safe education option. My 5-year-old daughter was not allowed to pretend she was a kitty or a pony. Satanic Christmas gifts were returned with a note to the giver explaining why we couldn't accept their gift. Turmoil in the toy box was presented at church. No more Scooby-Doo, Care Bears, and many other favorite toys. Our home was purged of all Disney items and replaced with Adventures in Odyssey from Focus on the Family. I recall with sadness the frightened look in my 7-year-old son's eyes after our pastor scared him into parting with his evil Pokemon cards. I was a true believer of the serious spiritual battle raging in the heavens for the souls of my children. What a relief now to see just this world and the beauty in it. It has been a long, slow journey to where I am now, and I'm not done learning, but I am done being afraid. In December, I told one of my grown daughters that I was an atheist, and she said, Now? You couldn't have figured this out sooner? And then she hugged me. Gwen, thank you so much for the message. Let me leave you and all of our listeners with this quote from Bertrand Russell, which I think is a great counter to all of the fear pimps out there who are trying to use fear as a control mechanism, to control minds, to control hearts, to control lives. The quote from Bertrand Russell says this: fear is the main source of superstition and one of the main sources of cruelty. To conquer fear is the beginning of wisdom. Thank you so much for listening to the show tonight. We didn't get to cover nearly all of the examples of satanic panic because there are so many out there, but it was an intriguing and interesting show. Next Tuesday night, it's called Debunking Christianity is the title of the show. My special guest is John W. Loftus. Join us next week on the Thinking Atheist Radio podcast. I'll see you later.
Follow The Thinking Atheist on Facebook and Twitter. Watch dozens of original videos on the Thinking Atheist YouTube channel. And visit our website for resources, links, contact information, the editor's blog, and more. thethinkingatheist.com.